Number 2, would you tell us your real name and what you do, please?
My name is Tom Landry. I'm defensive coach of the New York Football Giants.
I wanted to do the most in-depth deep dive on the Dallas Cowboys in 1960 ever. However, to make it more accessible to people that haven't seen some of my earlier videos, I decided to break them up into individual documentaries that aren't dependent on people seeing the earlier stuff. So, this begins in January of 1960, the year the Cowboys first joined the NFL, and all you need to know is the league is about to vote on whether or not Dallas will be able to join. Clint Murchison is the owner, and Tex Schramm is the general manager, and Tom Landry had just been hired to be their head coach. If you do, however, want a little bit more background, you can watch my 3-part series leading up to this year that talks about the life of Tom Landry and the events that transpired beforehand. I'll put a link in the description. Okay, let's get started. Sunday, January 17th, 1960. It is reported that NFL owners would be meeting at the Kenilworth Hotel in Miami to discuss not only who the new NFL commissioner would be after the death of Burt Bell, but as to whether or not they would allow expansion teams in both Dallas and Minnesota. In favor of this is George Halas of the Chicago Bears, along with Art Rooney of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Halas, being in charge of the NFL Expansion Committee, has a vested interest in this and has a difficult tightrope to walk. Opposing them is George Marshall of the Redskins, who claims he has enough votes to stop them. One of Marshall's fears is that if they put teams in places the new rival American Football League will use, this will invite Congress to intervene, charging the NFL with attempting to choke out the competition and maintain a monopoly. However, those in favor of expansion say that not acting could lead to the government putting in steps to protect the AFL. In other words, if the NFL doesn't do it at the same time, then the government might say this is established AFL territory. They got there first. Halas ruminated on the situation. This is the most delicate position I've been in since I've been in the league. I can afford to offend anybody. Part of the strategy involved him abstaining from voting on other issues to appear more neutral. Monday, January 25th. 21 ballots failed to elect a new NFL commissioner. It is noted that Halas has kept up a strategy and has not voted on anything since the previous Thursday. The attention is now on Marshall Leahy, an attorney from San Francisco, as a candidate for commissioner. It is reported that the pro-Leahy side is pressuring Halas to actually vote and put his toward Leahy in exchange for their vote on an NFL expansion. Halas hears about the story and grows irritated, claiming that it simply wasn't true. 9 votes are needed to elect a new commissioner, and the frontrunner, Leahy, currently only has 7. Halas continues to not vote, saying the NFL has a moral obligation to accept the expansion, and if they go back on their promise to do this, Halas would publicly name the cities that reneged. Wednesday, January 27th. It is announced the stalemate of commissioner has ended. Remember how 9 votes were necessary to elect a new one? Well, there was a loophole. 9 votes are required only if all 12 teams decide to vote. 75% of the vote, in other words. However, if some teams abstain from voting, then just as long as you still get 75%, you're okay. Well, there are 4 teams that didn't want Leahy, and one of the men, Carroll Rosenblum of the Colts, suggested Pete Rozelle of the Los Angeles Rams as a compromise. This led to 8 votes for Rozelle, 1 against, and 3 abstaining, thus making him the new commissioner, and as a bonus, he was in favor of expansion. Well, that's the story if you go by the Evening Star. Tom Landry, however, said it was Paul Brown from Cleveland and Wellington Mara that proposed Rozelle. Maybe all 3 suggested him, or maybe the Evening Star was wrong, or Landry didn't remember the story properly. It's hard to say, but having Rozelle as a commissioner helped the cause. Before Tex Graham, the Cowboys general manager, joined up with the Dallas group, he had spent several years with the Rams, and who did Tex hire in 1952 as a public relations director? Pete Rozelle. Thursday, January 28th. It is reported that today the issue of expansion was due. A 10-2 vote permitted the Constitution to be amended by a 10/12 vote, whereas before, unanimous approval was necessary to admit a new team. Now they need only 10 votes to admit Dallas. With 2 owners against this, however, only one more defection would stop them. Also, the hotel that day are Clint Murkison and Bedford Wynn, noted as co-owners of the Rangers, or the Cowboys as they of course would later be called, along with Tex Graham. Max Winter, representing the new hopeful Minnesota franchise, was also present. Dallas had already signed quarterback Don Meredith and halfback Don Perkins to personal services contracts, meaning that they had to get paid even if the Dallas franchise wasn't granted. And they'll be damn expensive salesmen if you don't have a team, noted Wynn. Speaking of Don Meredith, he would be one of the first true stars for the team, although he'd have to wait on the bench for a few seasons as an understudy to Eddie LeBaron, as was customary at the time, as opposed to the modern age where rookie quarterbacks were just thrown into the meat grinder. Don Perkins, meanwhile, was an All-American in 1959. Although he would get off to a rough start with Dallas, he would wind up having success and getting selected to the Pro Bowl 6 times. Even before the Cowboys franchise was officially approved to enter the NFL, Meredith was given a job at T-Con, which was a company operated by Dallas owner Clint Murkison, hence Wynn's comment about being stuck with just an expensive salesman. In the article, Wynn continued, stating that House had told him earlier the league had voted 11-1 to add Dallas and Houston, or another team, this year. In regard to Meredith and Perkins, they were going to be able to get them despite missing the draft, as House had foreseen this problem and in 1959 suggested Dallas go after these players. The rest of the league was informed so they wouldn't interfere, and Chicago ended up drafting Meredith and later trading him to Dallas. Friday, January 29th. It is reported that George Marshall at the last minute removed his objection to expansion. Dallas and Minnesota are voted in, with Dallas starting in 1960 and Minnesota to begin play the following year. And here you can see Marshall congratulating the new Dallas franchise, although no specifics are given on what changed his mind. And the final tally was actually 11 in favor. Walter Wolfner of the Cardinals abstained. So it turns out that Marshall's vote actually wasn't necessary, as the original unanimous rule had been changed earlier in the week to a 10/12 rule. So the next time you see someone say that the only reason why the Cowboys got into the league was because of Marshall changing his mind, that actually isn't true. In the past, I've been guilty of this too. This is a case of researchers looking up information and seeing something is true and assuming that it stayed true. But if you keep on reading, the rules were modified during the course of that week, so Marshall's vote was just one more vote piled on top of something that was already going to happen, whether he liked it or not. But saying they absolutely needed him is more dramatic, so that's what sticks. The price for league admission was $600,000, Dallas owning $200,000 up front, and the rest over the course of the next 2 years. And Joe Foss, the commissioner of the new AFL, was so thrilled he immediately threatened to take this issue up with the courts or even Congress. So the Rangers, who would change their name of course to the Cowboys, were in the league, and Texas football was never going to be the same. I wanted to address an issue with Washington owner George Marshall. In an earlier video, I said I wasn't able to find a contemporary source reporting on the Dallas group buying the rights to the Redskins fight song in order to pressure Marshall to vote for expansion. However, I mentioned this story was probably true. The fact a story from that time period couldn't be found isn't surprising, as for one, Marshall wouldn't tell anyone because that would be embarrassing for him, so why would he volunteer that information? And Murkison and Scram wouldn't say anything during that time because they were keeping the cards close to their vests. And after the ordeal was over, there would be a feeling of, we got what we wanted. Why rub this in when Marshall complied? So it's not unexpected. Well, on this issue, Landry, in his own writings, confirms this took place. So Marshall voted for expansion on January 28, 1960, which, by the way, just happened to be the 11th wedding anniversary of Landry and his wife Alicia. But again, this turned out not to be the deciding factor. The Cowboys, however, wouldn't have any draft picks, as the draft had already taken place, so Dallas still needed to fill out the roster. Tex Graham hires Gil Brandt, to go through the country looking for undrafted players. Landry writes that after Brant was done, they still had only 2 to 3 dozen men. Howell suggests having each NFL team give them a few veteran players, but the other teams were hesitant. The next owners' meeting would be in Los Angeles in March, so Landry goes there to plead his case, waiting outside the hotel conference room. Tex calls him in to say the other owners are ready, and I'll have Landry fill in what happened next, in his own words. I remember walking into the hotel conference room and looking around that big table at all those unfamiliar faces and thinking, they don't look very sympathetic. I had never felt comfortable standing up and making speeches, but I was desperate. In the 5 minutes they gave me, I told these owners Dallas could possibly be a competitive team unless we had a core of solid, experienced players. I argued that we had to fill a decent team if we expected to compete with the Dallas market against Lamar Hunt's AFL team, the Dallas Texans. And I pointed out that everyone in the NFL stood to lose gate receipts and other revenues if our team couldn't play the caliber of professional football the fans would demand. Landry left the room completely clueless as to whether or not the pleading worked, as the facial expressions never changed. Hours later, the owners agreed that each team would create a pool of 9 players. From each pool in each team, Dallas could only choose 3 men, and they gave them only 24 hours to make their picks. Well, 9 players according to Landry. However, the Green Press Gazette said it was 11, so it's hard to say which is correct. Regardless, they were going to have to go to work. Landry, having been hired a month before Dallas was admitted, however, had done his research, so he wasn't coming in completely unprepared. That being said, you can watch all the game film you want. However, when you're dealing with the 9 worst players in each team, they're not going to be showcased that much on video, because presumably they're going to be spending most of their time on the bench. On top of that, the teams could modify their player pools at any time by removing or adding other players. Landry spoke with the coaches to learn more, but this of course presented a problem as to whether or not they were going to even be honest with him. He even wondered if some coaches would use reverse psychology by hyping up a player they secretly wanted to keep. The logic being that if Landry saw a coach praising someone too much, he would become suspicious and not choose that person. Landry described the whole ordeal as a weird version of poker. In the end, he selected 36 players, including Frank Clark, Don Heinrich, and Jerry Tubbs. Although Clark didn't have that good of a year in 1960, starting only 3 games, he would go on to have at least 41 receptions each year from 1961 to 1965, and he would lead the NFL in touchdown receptions with 14 in 1962, and he would make the Pro Bowl in 1964. He was a good find for Dallas, as while he had been with the Browns for a few years beforehand, he didn't do much in Cleveland, and he wouldn't hit his stride until he was with the Cowboys. While Don Heinrich would not play a big part of the Cowboys' initial season, he represents Tom Landry's professional football roots with the New York Giants, as Landry was an assistant coach with the Giants, while Heinrich was serving as the backup quarterback. Unfortunately, Landry knew the majority of the players he had didn't give him much to work with. For their base of operations, the Cowboys' original home office would be at 4425 North Central Expressway, and you can see where their office building once stood as a new building for salons. On that spot, however, there had been a much larger building that the Cowboys shared with the Dallas chapter of AAA, so they weren't able to get their own building to themselves just yet. The Cowboys would be playing in the Cotton Bowl, which would be shared not only with the SMU football team, but also the Dallas Texans. For their upcoming regular season highlights, this would be handled by Telrod Productions, and they're actually still in business, at least on paper, although it appears they haven't done anything new in a while if you go by their highlight video. And one of the sponsors for Dallas would be Falstaff, a beer that was named after a Shakespeare character that was fat, vain, and boastful, so, an excellent person to name your mascot after. I'm going to backtrack a little bit so we can address the early history of Don Meredith. In particular, I wanted to cover the book Memories of Don Meredith, which is a bit unusual in terms of sport books, not only due to its appearance, but the fact that it's mostly just focused in high school, as opposed to a bigger look at college or his professional career. This is a collection of different things people wrote about him who are from his area, and it reads almost like a high school pamphlet. That being said, it's full of information about Meredith you may not be able to find anywhere else. Born on April 10, 1938 in Mount Vernon, Texas, Meredith, like his older brother Billy Jack, was gifted in sports. One of the favorite hangouts in town was the Jersey King, where you could get a burger for 25 cents. Meredith can be seen here as the tallest figure in the photo. He was with Arlene Mack in that picture, who would later recount the first time she met him. He was 5 and she was 3, and he stopped by the house to deliver milk as his father had owned a cow and her mother bought the milk. When they were older, she, being 2 years younger than him, would tag along with her friends, but mostly be viewed as a younger sister. Gladys Lawrence, who taught Meredith in the 3rd grade, remembers him as being one of the most polite students she ever taught and how she only had to get after him once. It was in the 3rd grade that the principal had approached her, asking if it would be okay for Meredith to miss some school time in order to practice football. She relented, as he could always make up the work later. Her husband would help him practicing throwing the football, and by the end of the practice season, he could throw the ball across the field. His father would also help out by swinging a tire from a tree and having Meredith and his older brother throw footballs through it. Even though he was in a popular group, he could stand up for other people. One story involves this girl from a poor family who brought a biscuit and onion to lunch. People started making fun of her until he sat down by her and shared lunch with her. That put a stop to it. When he was 13 or 14, he threw a birthday party, and Arlene Meek, being younger, wasn't approached by any of the boys, so she hid in the bushes and watched as the rest of the group played Spin the Bottle. Decades later, at a class reunion, she brought up the story to a mutual friend of Meredith's, and when Don heard about that birthday party, he responded by saying, "You mean the time she hid in the bushes all night?" He had seen her all along, but decided not to say anything. In high school, he would become a star in both football and basketball, where he would score 52 points in a single game, a record for the state of Texas that would take decades to break. Wayne Pierce, who coached Meredith in both sports, even said that in high school, Meredith was perhaps actually better at basketball. Meredith would get a start in high school football as a freshman when Edith Turner, their starting quarterback, got injured, and Meredith came in and played well, completing several passes, which was a sign of things to come. Another story of him standing up for other people involved a cherry bomb incident. One had gone off in the school, and he threatened to kick whichever player had thrown it off the basketball team. Meredith walked up and said he did it, even though another student said it wasn't his. Someone else had thrown it, and it happened to go by Meredith, who threw it again to get it away from himself. Regardless of whether or not that recollection of events is true, Meredith knew he had leverage as one of the best players, so because of his confession, no one would get kicked off the team. In his senior year, he started off well in football. However, in about their 4th game against Mount Pleasant, Meredith broke his collarbone, taking him out for several weeks. Getting back to Arlene, there was one more story which demonstrated his protective nature. She and a friend, while still in high school, had been approached by some older guys out of high school. She didn't say just how big the age difference was, but apparently it was cause for some concern. While they're hanging out in their car and Meredith pulls up in his car, sees Arlene with older guys who look like they're up to no good, and he makes her leave the car. She was embarrassed and mad, but later grateful for what he did. As far as his number 17 goes, his football jersey number in high school was 88, the same number as his older brother. According to his high school coach, Pierce, they had changed the rules of numbers players could wear based on position, so Meredith could no longer wear number 88. 1 plus 7 equals 8, so that would be used as a backup number, although he could be seen wearing number 17 in basketball in high school, and according to one student, he was still number 88 when he had that football injury, so it seems like although his decision may have been due to his brother, this was something that was decided years before the rule change. In 1956, despite his senior year injury, he attended SMU on a football scholarship where he would twice be selected as an All-American. Although he would date in high school, it wasn't until Southern Methodist University where he would meet his first wife, school cheerleader Lynn Schamberger. He wouldn't take his team to any bowl games, however they did crack the top 25 in 1958, where they ranked 18th. So it seems like the hype around him was more due to the potential he saw on the field rather than the final win-loss column. Regardless, Meredith graduates from SMU, and this takes us to 1960, where he's about to play his rookie season with the Cowboys. I want to now go over the timeline leading up to the start of the training camp. The majority of the information comes from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Once we get to the start of camp, then we'll go back to Tom Landry's account this year. April 5th, 1960, Tom Doms, former Pro Tackle Tuesday, was added to the coaching staff of the Dallas Cowboys. Doms was the defensive line coach at the University of Virginia the previous season. The announcement was made by General Manager Tex Graham. April 6th, they named Larry Carl, the athletic director at Tulane University, as Public Relations Director. Tex Schramm said Carl would take over his new duties later this month. Also on April 6th, it was announced the Dallas Cowboys would start their home schedule with 2 night games. They would face the Pittsburgh Steelers on a Saturday night on September 24th and the Philadelphia Eagles Friday on September 30th, as the Dallas Texans and the American Football League had priority dates in the Cotton Bowl and had taken the first 4 Sundays. This was due to the fact that the Texans started out earlier than the Cowboys, as they were chartered in 1959, and the Cowboys were officially admitted into the NFL until January. It should be noted, though, that the AFL began its season sooner than the NFL did, so this interfered with only 2 Cowboy games. And after those first 2 games, the Cowboys played nothing but Sunday games, alternating with the Texans on which team would have a home game, so it became pretty much even after that. If you believe in omens, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reported on April 18, 1960, that during a minor league baseball game between the Dallas-Fort Worth Rangers and the Denver Bears, a sign advertising the Dallas Cowboys coming to Dallas was struck when a home run was hit by Denver in their 11-2 blowout of the Texas team. On April 23rd, it was reported that the season tickets for the Dallas Cowboys' 6 National Football League games in the Cotton Bowl would go on sale Monday. Tex Schramm said season ticket purchasers could select the seats they wanted and keep them in succeeding seasons. On April 29th, University of New Mexico backfield star Don Perkins would join up with the Dallas Cowboys. On May 2nd, it was reported that the exhibition football game between the New York Giants and the Dallas Cowboys, scheduled for August 29th in Montreal, Canada, had been canceled. Ferdinand Dubois, general manager of the Montreal Royals, said he had been notified of the cancellation. That's right, the Cowboys in the preseason were going to play a game in Canada. And as an aside, the NFL and the Canadian Football League would periodically meet for exhibition games. However, this was put to a stop in 1961. On May 4th, it was reported that Lamar Hunt of the AFL claimed the Justice Department might keep the Cowboys from playing. This, of course, was in an effort to stop the NFL from encroaching in Dallas. According to Hunt, he was told that the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department had recommended an injunction. This would never come to pass, and so the first few years would have both the Texans and Cowboys competing for fans in Dallas before the Texans moved up to Kansas City to become the Chiefs. On May 14th, the Dallas Cowboys announced a large-scale, free children's ticket plan that would make it possible for almost any child to see the Cowboys' 6 home National Football League games at no cost. The plan, as outlined by Tex Schramm, would permit up to 5 children 12 years of age or under to enter Cowboys games when accompanied by at least 1 adult bearing an admission ticket. The ticket pricing would break down like this. May 24th, 1960, the Dallas Cowboys gave Don Meredith of SMU permission to play in the college all-star game against the NFL champion Baltimore Colts. The Colts would end up winning that game by a score of 32-7. June 2nd, 1960, it was announced that the inaugural training camp would be held at Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon. And this brings up something I wanted to provide clarification on. While Pro Football Reference mentions the Cowboys using St. John's Military Academy in Delafield, Wisconsin, that was actually their 2nd training camp location, which they used from August 21st to September 10th. June 8th, Dallas sportsman Fritz Hahn and Tody Lee Wynn Jr. joined Clint Murkison Jr. and Bedford Wynn in ownership of the Dallas Cowboys franchise. Fritz Hahn, who went by W.R. Hahn in the Cowboys media guide, can be seen toward the left. June 15th, more players were signed Wednesday by the Dallas Cowboys, including Frank Clark. June 18th, 1960. Tex Schramm said that while he saw the complaints from the AFL's antitrust suit, he was comfortable that there wasn't anything to it, and that ultimately the fans and not the courts would decide who would win out. However, if you go by the attendance records at first glance, it seemed he wasn't right. However, if you take the facts into full context, it appears to be exactly what happened. For example, if you compare the average home attendance for each team from 1960 to 1962, where they both played at the Cotton Bowl, you'll see the Texans beat the Cowboys in attendance 2 out of 3 years. So the Texans were more popular, right? Sure, but the important thing is they should have been way more popular, because the Texans had a winning record of 8-6 in 1960, while the Cowboys didn't win a single game. And despite this, they only averaged slightly more than 3,000 extra fans per game. Then, in 1961, when the Texans had a losing record of 6-8, the Cowboys outdrew them by a little less than 7,000. Despite the fact that the Cowboys also had a losing record, and they were worse, going 4-9-1. Finally, in the season when the Texans captured the title with an 11-3 record, they beat the Cowboys in attendance by an average of only 423. Only 423 fans separated a championship team from a Cowboy squad that managed to win just 5 games. This is the equivalent of an NBA star winning a street basketball game against a nobody by 3 points. The victory is good, but only if you completely ignore the context. On June 23rd, it was reported over the wire that the Washington Redskins traded veteran quarterback Eddie LeBaron to the Dallas Cowboys. He had announced his retirement to practice law at the end of the season, but he changed his mind provided he could be traded to Dallas since he planned to pursue his legal career in Texas. Already on the Cowboys roster at the quarterback slot were former New York Giant quarterback Don Heinrich and Don Meredith. On June 26, 1960, the Cowboys were hyping up their addition of LeBaron, with Larry Carl, the PR man, stating, "This makes us real solid at quarterback. With LeBaron, Don Heinrich, and Don Meredith signed, we'll have good depth where we need it." Meredith, of course, had no pro experience, but he would be a draw as he was a hometown star with his college SMU, using the very same stadium as the Cowboys. On July 6, the Cowboys expected 40 veterans and a flock of rookies to report for training camp at Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon. Rookies were to report Sunday for a week of special training. 4 of the Cowboys rookies would have their training camp cut short, including quarterback Don Meredith, as they were scheduled to play the college all-star game against the Colts, but they would rejoin the Cowboys immediately following the game. And here we join Tom Landry again with his notes on that first training camp. Landry mentioned in total they expected at least 193 people to show up. This was because of the desperation the team had in wanting to try out anyone they thought would even remotely have a chance. From the Portland airport, Greyhound buses would deliver new people, some of whom would show up for one day and never be seen again, having been immediately cut from the team. Landry said he wasn't discouraged, though, for 2 reasons. First off, his experience as a defensive coordinator for the Giants showed him what would work in offense and the strategies of what to use to build it up. Secondly, Landry had a 5-year contract, which gave him time for this building. By his own estimate, it would take him about 3 years to have a good team, and he anticipated winning only around 2 to 3 games that first year, but he wasn't being rushed. Management wasn't getting in the way and interfering. They were letting their coach do their job. On a completely unrelated topic, do you like the suit this random person is wearing? I think it's a bit stylish, and I might go with something similar. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Moving on, Landry said he actually had to talk Don Perkins out of going home after he failed to finish a mile run in under 6 minutes. He, however, would show flashes of brilliance in camp, and as mentioned, he would become a valuable part of the Cowboys' offense. And Landry also recognized the talent of Meredith, but he wished to take time to develop him, hence the Cowboys trading to get LeBaron from the Redskins. Landry mentioned that other than Perkins and Meredith, there weren't really any other bright spots in that 1960 training camp, except for Jungle Jamie. Let me explain. Jamie showed up on the second day of training camp in a 49 Ford with autographs apparently written all over the vehicle, with steer horns on the hood and what he claimed was bear meat hanging from the antenna, but Landry thought it just looked like beef. It gets more insane. He comes out walking barefoot with a rabbit on a leash. It gets more insane. He's holding a birthday cake and he presents it to Tom Landry. Landry said his birthday wasn't until September, and Jamie's reaction was to shrug and say he knew this, but he wanted Landry to have it early. Well, Landry revealed he actually knew Jamie dating back to 1956 when Landry was with the Giants. During that time, Jamie had a pet monkey in place of a rabbit. The Giants kicker took him in, gave him some money, and let him serve as a type of valet for the team. He even ended up playing Santa Claus at a Giants Christmas party. Landry described him as strange but harmless. The players there seemed to like him and his stories, and with the Cowboys, it seemed to be the same thing. So even though he wouldn't end up making the team, they kept him around at least during training camp. Everyone seemed to think he was okay, except for Tex Graham. Jamie didn't like the idea of Tex hanging around camp since he wasn't a player or coach, so Jamie started to call him a freeloader, and he even ended up nicknaming his pet rabbit Tex's Freeloader, which Tex didn't find funny. So Tex would comb the camp trying to find Jamie so he could kick him out, and this led to the Cowboy players hiding him in different rooms until Tex just gave up. And that's the story of Jungle Jamie, a weird and forgotten part of early Cowboys history. Now, back to the newspaper accounts. July 13th, Cowboys coach Tom Landry sent his NFL newcomers for their first uniform contact work. In terms of what the Cowboys players had to say during training camp, Eddie LeBaron mentioned, "Coaching is an important item in the National Football League, but we have a solid foundation in that department." He also said they were going to make it sooner than people thought. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the case. However, for the first part of the year, there was reason for optimism, as there would be two bright spots in the preseason and in the first two regular season games. Jerry Tubbs, former 49er linebacker, put it this way: "We will get consistently better each week. You won't recognize this ball club a month from now. All of us have been used to different systems and playing with different people." August 5th, Dallas Cowboys are on the eve of departure from training camp for Seattle and a preseason game with the San Francisco 49ers. They put the finishing touches in preparations for their first game, with Coach Landry sending the Cowboys through a lengthy review of both offense and defense. The team flew to Seattle. The Dallas team would put in another week at Pacific University before breaking camp for two Texas preseason games, with Don Heinrich getting the starting nod for the very first Cowboys game. So that's a useless piece of trivia for you. Who was the first Cowboys quarterback to ever start a game? It wasn't Eddie LeBaron, it was Don Heinrich. Well, the 49ers ended up winning 16-10, and here's some more useless trivia. Who was the first person to ever score any points in Cowboys history, meaning including preseason games? It was Dallas kicker Fred Cohn, who nailed a 17-yard field goal against the Niners. And who was the first to score a preseason touchdown? Frank Clark, who caught a 56-yard pass from LeBaron shortly after that field goal. Landry had this to say to the press after his first head coaching experience ever: "The boys played a better defensive game than I thought they would. We realized it would be difficult to beat a seasoned club during their first game, but their showing was encouraging." August 11th, the Dallas Cowboys held another long workout at Forest Grove Wednesday, and Coach Tom Landry said he would juggle the lineup extensively for their next NFL exhibition game. He said the biggest change will be in a starting quarterback spot, with Eddie LeBaron starting against the St. Louis Cardinals Saturday in San Antonio in place of Don Heinrich, who got the nod when they lost their opening game last week. The other big backfield change would be to put Dupre in place of Don McElhaney. August 19th, Johnny Unitas engineered a comeback touchdown drive with a long bomb to Lenny Moore in the last minute to get Baltimore past the Cowboys 14-10. The Cowboys were on the brink of an upset until defensive halfback Johnny Sample intercepted an Eddie LeBaron pass late in the game. After it was over, Tom Landry said the team deserved to win with the effort they put forth. Landry commented, "I'm not taking anything away from the Colts," and he noted it was a perfect play to come from behind and win, but he said, "Our players went out all the way, and I'm mighty proud of the way they kept going after the Colts." In their next preseason game against the Giants, Landry remembered Meredith going up to the line of scrimmage, but seeing that Sam Huff was right in the place where the blocking hole of the play was supposed to be, so Meredith called an audible. The Giants adjusted for this, immediately filling another gap, so he called for a second one. The Giants then filled that gap too. Meredith struggled to think of another audible, stuttered his words, and then said a word that needs to be censored, followed by him yelling, "Timeout," which resulted in the Giants players laughing. The Cowboys, however, would come away with a 14-3 victory. Back to the newspaper accounts. September 4th, it was reported Meredith would lead the Cowboys against the Los Angeles Rams Sunday. Unfortunately, it would not be a good day for Dallas, as they would lose 49-14. September 6th. Because of the heat, the Dallas Cowboys worked out for only an hour. Coach Tom Landry said the Cowboys' biggest trouble in the defeat against the Rams was on pass defense. And against their Packers in their final preseason game, Green Bay edged the Dallas Cowboys 28-23 in a last quarter 12-yard pass from Bart Starr to Paul Hornung. Landry, after the game, said the defense actually knew what the Packers were going to do on that winning play, however, they were able to cover it. So in total, we have the Cowboys going 1-5 in the preseason with the following results. For their opening regular season game, it was announced the king of the Cowboys, Roy Rogers, would be on hand when the Cowboys would take on the Pittsburgh Steelers in the Cotton Bowl. Rogers would be the main attraction in a pregame show that would also include his wife, Dell Evans. Both would also take an active part in the halftime ceremonies. And now that the preseason is finished, I wanted to cover in detail something I came across that I had shown in one previous video, the 1960 Dallas Cowboys Media Guide. This, of course, was a guide that was given to people in the media, whether it be in print, radio, or television. It doesn't say specifically when this was printed. However, if you read the text inside, the preseason had already finished, so this was something that would have come out in September between the end of the preseason and the start of the regular season, which would mean it was presumably released between September 12th and September 23rd, 1960. On the cover, you can see their original logo featuring Cowboy Joe. This goes with the cartoon style that was popular in the late 50s and early 60s. For example, you have the Browns and the 49ers logos. And in 1962, the Steelers would use this. In fact, this style and similar styles would even make their way into some beer commercials, such as Falstaff, which of course sponsored highlight reels for the NFL. On the opposite side of the cover, you can see the old-style phone numbers for the Cowboys' office and home. This is because of the system of telephone exchanges. People would be given 5 numbers that were unique to a specific service area that they were in, and the tailor part in the beginning denotes which area. It's spelled out this way with letters instead of numbers in order to make it easier to remember, as operators had to physically reroute calls outside your area. So the Cowboys' TA, as in Taylor, would be used. However, even in Dallas, they had different service areas. For example, this store in a different section of Dallas used RI as in Riverside, despite how relatively close it was to the Cowboys' office. On page 1, you can see a list of personnel for the Cowboys organization, including Jack Eskridge, the equipment manager, who was responsible for designing the original Cowboys star. On the following page, you see their schedule. Note how late in the season it begins. They didn't play their first game until September 24th, which was on a Saturday, and their next game would be played on a Friday night. On page 3, we see the names of the hotels the Cowboys would be staying at during their away games. In particular, for their first game against the Packers, they would be at the Northland Hotel, which, if you know a lot about the Packers' history, you'll know this was the same hotel where Vince Lombardi held his very first official press conference in 1959 as the new Green Bay coach. And their schedule for flights is outlined as them flying out on Friday, working on their opponent's field on Saturday, and then playing their games on Sunday before leaving Sunday night. As an aside, the NFL started chartering flights in the 1960s, meaning the teams would have the planes to themselves without other passengers. However, I wasn't able to confirm if this was the case or not for the Cowboys for 1960. As recent as the late 1970s, the New Orleans Saints had problems with chartering planes, noting they were only able to do this for about 75% of them, so if you flew either to New Orleans or outside the city during that time, there was a chance you could be on the same plane as the Saints football team. However, the situation with the Cowboys is unclear. Regardless of the flight status, the team's publicity director, which would have been Larry Carl, would show up 3 days before the rest of the team and then leave the same night as everyone else. And you can see him here using a voice kidnappers use because of apparent audio issues with the film.
As we did last year, we have been hurt somewhat with some key injuries, but overall we think we have a better ball club than we did at this stage last year.
On the following pages, you see a nice bio of Tom Landry along with a photo of him and his assistants. And on page 8, we see a list of the players. Of this list, the only one that would be selected to the Pro Bowl at the end of the 1960 season was end Jim Doran, who can be seen on page 10. He, however, would start 0 games in 1961 and would retire after that season. Billy Houghton is another player of note. He was highly sought after by Dallas prior to the 1960 season. He was a 3-time Pro Bowler with the Packers. Although he wouldn't have the impact they wanted in 1960, starting 7 games, he would pick it up in 1961 and 1962 with 56 and 49 catches, respectively. On page 13, we have Eddie LeBaron, who again was the first quarterback to start a season in Cowboys history. He had an impressive-looking highlight reel, but you also have to factor in the lowlights. He would throw 25 interceptions in 1960, which led the league, although he and his team would improve, leading him to actually be selected for the Pro Bowl in 1962, even though he only started 6 games. That's right, Don Meredith was not the first Cowboys quarterback selected to the Pro Bowl. On the bottom of page 14, we have running back Don Perkins. It mentions that he injured his foot and he would miss a great deal of the early season. Well, it turned out to be the entire season as shown before, but he would start in 1961 and his career would pick up in a big way from there. On page 16, we see the NFL passing stats of LeBaron and Heinrich and the college stats for Meredith at page 17, where he would set the then NCAA record for highest career completion percentage at 61%. To put it into the perspective of the time, even though I wasn't able to find LeBaron's or Heinrich's college stats, their NFL career completion percentages were both under 50%, with LeBaron completing 49.5% and Heinrich at 40%. When compared to modern quarterbacks, as of this recording, Meredith is 9 percentage points below the all-time leader, Will Rogers, and he should be in the top 250 for career college completion percentage. But if you go to the Sports Reference website, his name is not there, despite the fact that his percentage is better than the bottom 5 quarterbacks. With a 61.01 completion percentage, at worst, he should be at spot 246, and maybe even a couple spots higher. For shame, sportsreference.com. For shame. On pages 18 and 19, we see a list of people who would cover the Cowboys in 1960, along with the TV stations that would show the games. All the major Texas cities seem to be covered, except when it comes to radio, which comprises a shorter list, with Austin being absent. There seems to be a page missing as it goes straight from 19 to 21, but here in page 21, we see the Cowboys roster with 42 players listed. And the smallest, not surprisingly, was Eddie LeBaron at 5'7" and 160 pounds. On pages 22 to 33, we see the list of the regular season opponents. On page 35, we see a list of the all-league teams, but starting on page 36, we have the league records as of the end of 1959, and I wanted to take a quick detour here because it's fascinating to see how different the records were back then. For example, there had never been a quarterback that had thrown for over 3,000 yards in a season. The most touchdown passes thrown in a single year was 32, done by Johnny Unitas in 1959, which is especially impressive considering it was in 12 games and defenses were allowed to physically bully receivers. The second most ever was 25 touchdown passes, and that was tied by Sammy Baugh and Tommy Thompson. In fact, the first quarterback to pass for at least 10 touchdowns in a season was Sammy Baugh in 1940 with 12. With receiving, the record for most catches in the season was 84 by Tom Fears, and the most touchdown receptions was 17, which was achieved both by Don Hudson and Elroy Hirsch. The record for rushing was Jim Brown with 1,527 yards in 1958. On defense, the record for interceptions was Dick Night Train Lane with 14, and the most field goals ever made in a season was 23 by Lou Groza. In the last 2 pages, it talks about the city of Dallas and once again shows the regular season schedule of the Cowboys, sponsored by Falstaff Beer. What a model mascot. As shown in the earlier photo, the Cowboys office was located on the 2nd floor of an office building shared by an auto club, where they would work in small cubicles as they frantically tried to call around looking for trades to make their team better. Meanwhile, downstairs, the other group in the building were much more relaxed. During the regular season, the only place the Cowboys could find to practice was Burnett Field, which was an old abandoned minor league stadium. That's right, the Cowboys didn't have their own unique place to work out. And there was a rat problem in the locker room. At night, they would chew on the equipment and damage things, so this led to them hanging their equipment at night from wires in the middle of the room, away from where the rats could reach. This seems a little far-fetched, but the account comes directly from Tom Landry. And the showers there were never hot, and in the winter it got really cold. So cold, in fact, that somebody lit a fire inside of a trash barrel to keep warm. During the middle of practice, they saw smoke pouring out of the locker room, so Landry and the other coaches ran to put it out. He noted, however, that most of the players that stood there probably watching in hope the place would burn down and they get to practice elsewhere. In one home game, attendance was so low, Landry at first wondered if his team had accidentally showed up on the wrong date. In another game, it was raining, and there were so few fans, they were able to crowd up under the concession stands to shield themselves from the rain, leaving the entire rest of the stadium basically empty. Landry writes, however, that it was still exciting to be part of a brand new franchise, and that Tex and Merkinson hadn't expected that much either out of the first season, so things were tempered. Now on to the regular season recap. In their opener against the Pittsburgh Steelers in the Cotton Bowl, the Cowboys would strike fast, taking a 21-7 lead against Pittsburgh. Steelers quarterback Bobby Lane, however, would engineer a comeback, and they would end up losing to Pittsburgh 35-28. In the next game, although the final score would end up being close, Eddie LeBaron had a hard time against the eventual 1960 NFL champion Philadelphia Eagles, as he would throw 5 interceptions. Still, though, the Cowboys would never trail by more than 10 points, and they managed to lessen the Eagles to 20-18 in the fourth quarter. However, the Eagles would run for a 23-yard touchdown to pull ahead by 9 points, and a Cowboys counter touchdown would make the final score Eagles 27, Cowboys 25. Against the Redskins, LeBaron threw for almost 300 yards. However, they were only able to translate that into 2 touchdowns as Washington won 26-14. The next week, the Browns did pretty much anything they wanted, beating Dallas 48-7, with the Cowboys' lone score coming in the fourth from Heinrich, after the Browns had already racked up 48. As an aside, Len Dawson, who would later rise to fame with the Chiefs, was the Browns' quarterback for that day, although it appears he alternated with Milt Plum, as Plum had passes in both the first and fourth quarter, but Dawson had more throws for the game. At 0-4, the Cowboys would play the St. Louis Cardinals, and they would actually have the lead in the fourth before the Cards would get a field goal to win it 12-10. Afterward, the PR man Carl had this to say about his conversation with Landry. Tom was feeling low too, but he lifted me up. He quietly told me that we can't expect to cut into anybody, and then he told me where we need help. The morale of the team is wonderful despite our weekly losses, and that's part of the battle right there. Then they played the defending champion Colts, and although Baltimore entered this game at 3-2 and not really looking like champions, they were able to steamroll the Cowboys 45-7, with LeBaron completing as many passes as interceptions, with 3. Against the Rams, Los Angeles was able to pull away in the second half with 14 unanswered points to win 38-13. And the Rams quarterback for that day was Frank Ryan, who would later go on to win a championship with the Browns. This game would actually be Don Meredith's first NFL regular season start, and he completed just 9 out of 28 passes for 75 yards, no touchdowns, and an interception. Now 0-8, the Cowboys were playing Vince Lombardi's Packers, and this was another case of a team doing whatever they wanted. After the time with the New York Giants, aside for a preseason match, this was the very first meeting between Lombardi and Landry as opponents in a game that actually meant something, and the Packers went ahead 41-0 in the fourth quarter. This game would see Meredith being brought in late in the game. Art Daly, sports writer from Green Bay, had described Meredith pregame as a Sammy Baugh type passer. Although he had a bad game the week before, this was actually a decent one for Meredith despite the final score. He completed 9 of 16 passes for 92 yards and 1 touchdown pass with no interceptions. Not the greatest stats in the world, but for someone at this stage who was essentially just a rookie bench warmer, it wasn't too bad. Final score, Packers 41, Cowboys 7. The next game against the 49ers, Meredith had thrown a touchdown pass, and the Cowboys had a 7-6 halftime lead. Meredith would finish the game 7 of 12 for 54 yards and 1 touchdown with 1 interception. However, the 49ers would get the lead, but LeBaron, now at quarterback, would throw a 76-yard touchdown pass to Frank Clark to put the Cowboys ahead 14-9. LeBaron, however, would also throw 3 interceptions, and the Niners would finish the game with 17 unanswered points to win 26-14. Against Chicago, Meredith stayed out of this game, with Don Heinrich doing most of the passing. He threw for 202 yards with 1 touchdown and no interceptions. He also, however, completed only 10 of 25 passes, and their 1 single score resulted in a 17-7 loss. In their next to last game, they would manage to tie Lombardi's former team, the New York Giants, 31-31. In that game, LeBaron threw 2 touchdown passes in the fourth quarter. When they got back to Love Field, Landry said there was a huge crowd of 2 people awaiting them, with one of them holding up a sign that said, "Well done, Cowboys." In their final game against the Lions, LeBaron started, completing 18 out of 27 passes for 195 yards, with 1 touchdown and 1 interception. However, they would only have 7 points until the fourth quarter, and Detroit would end up winning 23-14. So the Dallas Cowboys would finish off the season without a single win, going 0-11-1. There was room for optimism, however, as the rookies would in theory get better, and the Cowboys would actually get to participate in next year's draft, so they could continue to build up what they started, with Tom Landry leading the way. That's all for now. I don't have a set schedule for the order of topics I'll handle next. It may be a continuation of my look at Vince Lombardi, or I may opt to continue my documentaries on Tom Landry and the Cowboys. Regardless of what I get to first, I will continue my deep dive on the Cowboys' early history. That's definitely going to happen. Right now, we already have over 2 hours of runtime in a look at the early Cowboys history, and we've only gone up to the year 1960. My goal was to create the most extensive look at Tom Landry and the Cowboys ever made, and I believe I'm in the process of accomplishing this. See you next time.